Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 10th Grammar Clinic session. So it's nice to have everybody here. And today we're going to be talking about something that will be super useful for you when it comes to assignment writing time. Now, remember, if you do ever want to join one of these grammar clinics live, you can do it every Monday at 10 o'clock in the morning. And if you do that, then you can interact with the session, you can ask questions, you can check your answers, things like that. So remember, if you do want to join, you can do that. Every week we send out the links to the Microsoft Teams meetings. So remember to invite your classmates to come along and join in on the session. So today we are going to be looking at relative clauses and using relative clauses to add details to our writing to make it more informative, things like that. Okay, so the things we're going to look at today are we're going to recap what we already know about relative clauses. We're going to introduce them. We're going to talk about the different types, both defining and non-defining relative clauses. Then we're going to see if we can master them by doing a little activity. And then we're going to summarize before we finish up for today. Okay. So let's have a look at this little idea to begin with first. So it tells us, in a crowded room, how would you point out a specific person to your friend? So have a little think about that. How would you do it? What words would you use? Hmm? So I'm sure you're all coming up with great ideas here, but you would probably have something like this. Can you see the tall girl who is wearing a red dress? Okay, so that would be a nice, normal, usual way of doing it. So let's think about then, where is the relative clause in this sentence? Okay, all right. So are you able to spot where it is? Well, you'll find out that it is the part that begins with who, the person who, the place where, the time when, the reason why. Okay. So can you see the tall girl who is wearing the red dress? The who is part is the relative clause. Okay. So that's what we're going to have a look at today about those relative clauses that add information to a sentence. Okay, so our learning outcomes then. By the end of this lesson, we're going to understand relative clauses and how they can enhance our writing. We're also going to be doing a little bit of writing as well, where you're going to be creating sentences with relative clauses, the examples of which are who, which, where, when, whose, and that. So let's have a little bit of a recap then of how we actually create sentences. Okay, so every sentence should have a subject and a verb, and most sentences have a subject, a verb, and an object as well. So if we look at this example sentence underneath, we've got Chris designed the new gallery. So we have Chris is the subject, that is the person or the thing that the sentence is talking about. We have the verb designed, and designed, the verb describes the action or the state in the sentence. Okay. And the new gallery is our object. That is the thing or the person who receives the action. Okay. So Chris designed it. The gallery was designed by Chris. The action is designing. So most sentences that we will look at follow that kind of structure of having a subject, a verb, and have an object as well. So what are relative clauses? This is the topic of our grammar clinic today. So relative clauses are those parts of the sentence that provide additional information about the noun, about the object of the sentence. Okay, so it might provide a definition or it might just provide extra information about it. And they begin with those words like who, which, that, whose, etc. Okay? So they give more detail about the noun that they are modifying, and they help to clarify it or define it within that sentence itself. So let's look at this example sentence here. So Chris, who is an architect. So Chris is our noun, our subject, and we want to provide some extra information about Chris. So we know Chris designed the new gallery, but we also want to say that he is an architect. So we can provide extra information about Chris by using a relative clause. So this part here, who is an architect, that is our relative clause. It begins with one of those words like who, which, that, and whose, and then it provides an extra bit of information about him. Okay, so that is an example of one type of relative clause. We'll look at the other ones very, very soon. Okay, so in the previous one, we saw that we can use who, which, that, and whose, but there are some other ones that we can look at as well. So let's think about the situations in which we use who or which. Okay, so for who is primarily about people. So I have a friend who volunteers at the museum. So the who refers to the friend. The friend is a person. So that is why we would use who. Okay. If you think of other examples, like a plumber is a person who repairs showers and baths. Okay. So the next one that we have here is for which. So which is used for animals and for things, so objects primarily. Okay. So if you're describing any item or any object or animal, thing, something like that, you can use which for that. Okay. So we look at this example sentence here. The sculpture, which is displayed in the museum, is a masterpiece. Okay. So we've got which is talking about the sculpture. So we know that the sculpture is displayed in the museum. So a sculpture is a thing. So that is why we would use which. So we know the sculpture is a masterpiece and we know the sculpture is displayed in the museum. The third relative pronoun that we can use is where. So where indicates a place. Okay. So in the example sentence, I went to the museum where the dinosaur exhibition took place. Where is describing a place, and the place we're talking about is the museum. Okay. So I went to the museum where, so we know it's describing the place, the museum, okay, where the dinosaur exhibition took place. Okay, so they are the first three. We've got three more coming up. So, as you can imagine, when we use when, we are describing a specific time. So the day when the art gallery opened was memorable. So because we use when, we're talking about a time, and the time is that day. Okay, the next one we have here is whose. So whose is separate from who because whose describes the possession of a person. Okay, so if we're talking about an item or something that is owned or possessed by a person, then we use who. Right? So in the example sentence, it says the painter whose collection we admired. The collection is of the painter, so that is why we would use whose. Okay. So on to the last one here, we have that. So that can be used for people. It can be used for animals. It can be used for things. So it's quite a general one. It can be used for quite a lot of different situations. Okay. So in the example sentence, it tells us there is a cat that likes to sleep on the steps. So that refers to a person, an animal, or a thing. So here it refers to the cat. So we get some extra information about that cat. All right. So now that we've learned all of the relative pronouns, now let's think of the types of relative clauses that we can create. Okay. So the first one we're going to have a look at, so there are two. So the first one we're going to have a look at is something called a defining relative clause. And it kind of explains itself because it is the relative clause which defines the noun that we're talking about. Okay? So if we look at this one, this is the golden coin. So there are many golden coins in the world, but we're talking about a specific one. We are defining which golden coin we're talking about. So we know we are talking about the golden coin that was found in the cave. So there are millions of golden coins, but we're talking about this specific one. So it defines the coin that we're talking about. It gives a definition, a meaning for that coin. So the defining relative clause provides essential information about the noun that we're talking about. If we don't have the information, the meaning of the sentence is unclear. So if we say this is the golden coin, like which one are we talking about? We need to be more specific. So that's why we add in the relative clause here. So that's the defining relative clause. We're now going to look at maybe the opposite to this one, which is the non-defining relative clause. So this doesn't provide a definition. This provides extra information. Okay, so because it is extra information, the sentence still makes sense, still has a logical meaning without this, but we are just adding this in for a little bit of extra flavor for the sentence. Okay, so we can begin with the golden coin was found in the cave. We can say the golden coin, which is very old, was found in the cave. Okay, the sentence still has logic without the relative clause. The golden coin was found in the cave. So it makes sense without it, but it just adds a little bit of extra detail. Okay, all right. So the first one is absolutely necessary, the defining one. The non-defining one is not necessary, but it just adds some extra stuff. So let's focus more on the defining clause for now. Okay? So let's look at this sentence here. I want to buy the painting that depicts the mountains. The defining clause that we have here is that depicts the mountains. So this helps us to identify which particular painting we're talking about. Okay, so there are lots of paintings in the world, but we are talking about this specific painting. Okay. All right. So we need to give we need to give the specific information here about which painting we're talking about. Okay. So that's why it is a defining relative clause. All right. So we're going to have a little bit of practice here. We are going to combine the nouns that we have here in this box with one of the relative pronouns in the second box in order to form a meaningful sentence. Okay. So take a couple of minutes, see if you can make a sentence with both the portrait and the museum, and maybe one of these relative pronouns that we have here. Okay, so pause the video here, take a couple of minutes to produce your sentence, and then we'll come back. Okay. Okay, so I'm sure everybody has written down some good sentences here, but let's have a look at a particular example we could have, which is the painter sorry, the portrait that was painted by Sarah is displayed in the museum. Okay, so we've used the portrait, we've used the museum, and we've used a relative pronoun that to create a defining relative clause here. That was painted by Sarah. Okay, because we need to know which portrait we're talking about, and we need the specific one painted by Sarah. Okay, let's move on to the non-defining relative clauses then. So like we said before, they add extra information to a sentence, but they are not completely necessary for it. Okay, so we've got two sentences here. Kent was making a clay vase yesterday. He loves art lessons. Okay, so the second sentence adds some extra information to the first sentence, so we can add it in We're using a non-defining relative clause, okay, just to add the extra information in. So remember, we can remove the information and the sentence still makes sense, but we're just adding it in for a bit of fun, okay? So we can say Kent was making a clay vase yesterday, or Kent, who loves art lessons, was making a clay vase yesterday. Okay, so because it is extra information, we need to show that to the reader. So what we do is we put a comma before and after the relative clause, who loves art lessons. Okay, all right. So just to signify that it is non-essential information, we add a comma before and a comma after. Okay. All right. So that is one of the things we do when we make non-defining relative clauses. Okay. So we put it between commas, as we say. All right. So that is non-defining. So let's have a look at this with a bit more information. Okay. All right. So if we look here, we've got Kent was making a clay vase yesterday. Okay. The relative pronoun is who. Then we've got the relative clause, loves art lessons. So normally, a relative pronoun is used at the beginning of a relative clause. Okay. And it always refers back to the earlier mentioned noun or pronoun. So in this case, this is Kent. So it comes to the one that is before it. Okay. All right. So now that we've looked at the different relative pronouns and we've looked at the different types of relative clauses, I think it's about time that we have a little bit of practice, don't you think? Okay. So in this activity then, we are going to be using our knowledge of relative clauses in order to complete the exercises. So in this in this activity here, we've got the girl is staring out of the window. The girl is wearing an orange dress. So what we need to do is to make a sentence that combines both of those two ideas, but using a relative clause. Okay? The other thing we need to think about then is it a defining or a non-defining clause? Okay? So again, a couple of minutes, write down your answer, okay, of how you would combine those sentences using a relative clause. And then we'll check your answers. Okay, so one possible answer you could have is the girl who is staring out the window is wearing an orange dress. Okay, so there are many girls, let's imagine, but we are focusing just on the one who is staring out of the window. Okay, so our relative clause here is who is staring out the window. All right, all right, and that is essential information because it defines who the girl is. Okay, so it's a defining relative clause. There we go. Well done. Okay, so on to question two. We've got the portrait is one of the most famous paintings in the world. It has been with the Art Museum in Paris since 1804. So again, think about how would you combine them into one sentence using a relative clause, and then you need to think, is it defining or is it non-defining? Okay, then. So one way you could combine them is by using their sentence. This portrait, which has been with the Art Museum in Paris since 1804, is one of the most famous in the world. So I hope you had that one. And you should know then that it is a non-defining relative clause for two reasons. First of all, it is in between commas, which has been the Art Museum, blah, blah, blah. Okay. Also, it only provides extra information about the sentence. Okay. We can remove it and it still makes sense. So that is how it is non-defining. Okay. So that is just as then trying to make sentences for ourselves. Let's look at now choosing the right relative clause. The right relative pronoun. Okay. All right. So have a look at the sentence here, and then you need to decide which from the list of relative pronouns you would use to complete the sentence. Okie dokie. So your answer here should be who, because we are referring to Michael. Michael is a person, so that is why we would use the relative pronoun who. So on to the second one. Here we've got we visited the museum, the dinosaur fossils were displayed. So which relative pronoun would you use? Well, you should be using where, because we're speaking about a museum, a location, a place. So that is why you would use where. On to the third question. Okay. So you've got the day. The exhibition opened, was filled with excitement. So which relative pronoun would you use to describe the day? Well, you would use when, because the day is referring to a time. So that is why you would use when. On to the fourth question then. We see that the Pharaoh statue is made of solid gold, was discovered in the ancient tomb. So we're referring to the statue. So which relative pronoun would you use? Well, in this situation, probably we would use which because it's talking about an object. On to number 5. Okay, we've got ancient Egyptians, fascinating histories, have captivated historians, are widely studied today. So which relative pronoun would you use? Now, I'll just remind you to be careful here because are we talking about the Egyptians or about the histories? So you should be using whose because we're describing the histories which belong to the Egyptians. They are the possessions of the Egyptians. So you need to use whose instead of using who. Okay, on to the next one. The vase sits on the shelf is crafted by a famous artist. So we've got vase. So this is an object. So you could use that in this situation. Okay. All right, so we have come to the end of our uh, presentation now about relative clauses. So let's just have a quick summary of everything that we've had a look at so far. So we found out that relative clauses give us extra additional information about a noun in a sentence, giving us more specification of it and more depth to the ideas given in the sentence. There are these relative clauses which always include a word like who, which, when, where, whose, and that. We have defining relative clauses which give us essential information about the noun, and the information cannot be removed without the sentence being without any sense. Then we have non-defining relative clauses, which add extra information, but this is not essential to the sentence, so you could remove it and it still makes sense. Okay, so a little bit of homework for you guys, an assignment for you to do after you've watched this video. So I would like you to think about a famous business person. So it could be someone real or it could be someone from fiction instead. And I would like you to create 3 sentences about this person. And you need to describe them using relative clauses in order to give some specific details about that person. So make sure you think about the industry that they are in and the time period that they live and try to create some sentences about it. Right? And if you have done this assignment, what you can do is you can send those sentences to our email address, which you can see on the screen here. So it is English support _ Manchester WH at esl.ac.uk. All right. So you can send them to us. We will check them for you and send them back to you with a couple of notes about it. Okay, so if you don't know already, so I'm Kieran, the one here on the right. Christine is my colleague, and we are your English support tutors at the Manchester campus of Elizabeth School of London. And we are there to help you for any of your English for academic purposes needs. so you can see what we can help you with here on the screen. So if you ever need any support at all, please just get in touch with us. Okay. And also, we have a YouTube channel. So if you scan this QR code, it will take you to our channel where you can find all of the workshops that we have ever created on there, recorded by Christine and myself. Okay. So thank you everybody for attending today. Remember to attend next Monday at 10 o'clock for our 11th session of our grammar clinics. And we'll have something fun. And I'm looking forward to it. So I'll see you all then and have a good day.